Good morning. We're back here again. Reading in Luke 22 is where we left off. Let's just start right back in. It says, now we're in verse 63. Now the men who held Jesus mocked him and beat him. And having blindfolded him, they struck him on the face and asked him, saying, Prophesy, who is the one who struck you? And many other things they blasphemously spoke against him. And as soon as it was day, the elders of the people, both chief priests and scribes, came together and led him into their council, saying, If you are the Christ, tell us. But he, Jesus, said to them, If I tell you, you will by no means believe. And if I also ask you, you will by no means answer me or let me go. Hereafter the Son of Man will sit at the right hand of the power of God. So he said, why bother? Why bother answering you anything? You don't believe me? I've told you, you won't believe me. You're not going to let me go. He said, I know what you're going to do, and from this point forward, I'll sit at the right hand of God. Then they all said, Are you then the Son of God? So he said to them, You rightly say that I am. Now this was great blasphemy to the Jews. And they said, What further testimony do we need? For we have heard it ourselves from his own mouth. Chapter 23. Then the whole multitude of them arose and led him to Pilate. Now you're going to see two characters come into play here. One is Pilate. Pilate was like the governor or the administrator of Judea, where Jerusalem was. He was like the Roman representative over that part of Israel. And then Herod was the same kind of person. He was more of the ruler over Galilee, where Jesus was from, up north of Jerusalem. So you're going to see those two come into play here. And so they began to accuse him. Then the whole multitude of them rose up and led him to Pilate. And they began to accuse him, saying, We found this fellow perverting the nation and forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar, saying that he himself is Christ, a king. Well, they're lying right there. Jesus had just said, Give unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar. So they were just making stuff up. They were fake news. That's what it is. It's fake news of the time. Then Pilate asked him, saying, Are you the king of the Jews? And he answered him and said, It is as you say. So Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowd, I find no fault in this man. But they were the more fierce. Now, talking about they were the more fierce. That's the religious leaders, the scribes, the Pharisees, the chief priests, all of those people. But they were the more fierce, saying, He stirs up the people, teaching throughout all of Judea, beginning from Galilee to this place, so up north in Galilee, all the way down in Jerusalem. Now when Pilate heard of Galilee, he asked if the man was a Galilean. And as soon as he knew that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who was also in Jerusalem at that time. So it was Passover, so Herod was in town, and Herod and Pilate didn't get along up to this point. But Pilate was trying to shift the blame, get it out of his bailiwick. He said, Man, I don't want to deal with this. I'm going to send him over to Herod. So when Herod saw Jesus, he was exceedingly glad, for he had desired for a long time to see Jesus, because he had heard of the many, many things about him, and he hoped to see some miracle done by him. So Herod was at that point a fan from afar. He's like, Man, I've heard about the blind seeing, the lame walk, and the lepers being cleansed. I want to see some of this. And so he was glad to see him. So he began to question him, verse 9, with many words, but Jesus would answer him nothing. And the chief priests and the scribes stood and vehemently accused him. So they were there on the sideline just accusing Jesus, one false accusation after another. And the chief priests and the scribes stood and vehemently accused him. Then Herod, with his men of war, so his soldiers, treated him with contempt and mocked him, arrayed him in a gorgeous robe, sent him back to Pilate. So started off, Herod, he was excited to see Jesus, but he kept hearing all these accusations against Jesus, and he was asking himself, Jesus, these questions, and Jesus wouldn't even reply. So Herod turned in just a matter of a little bit. He turned from being a fan of Jesus and wanting to get to know him to being totally irritated. And it wasn't just natural circumstances. The forces of darkness were very much in play right at that moment, driving the religious leaders of the time, driving Pilate, driving Herod, driving the crowd of people. And so Herod just got caught up in that. And so that very day, so then Herod with his men treated him, and they sent him back to Pilate. Verse 12. That very day, Pilate and Herod became friends with each other. So they bonded over this. For previously they had been at enmity with one another. Then Pilate, when he had called together the chief priests, the rulers, and the people, said to them, "You have brought this man to me as one who misleads the people. And indeed, after having examined him in your presence, I have found no fault in this man concerning those things of which you accuse him. No, neither did Herod, for I sent him back to him, and indeed nothing deserving of death has been done to him." So in other words, I've questioned him, Herod's questioned him. We can't find anything in this guy to be put to death for. So he said, "I will therefore chastise him." In other words, I'll chastise him, probably have him beat with rods and beat with a whip or canes, and then I'm going to turn him loose and release him. Verse 17, "For it was necessary for him to release one of them at the feast. And they cried out at once, saying, 'Away with this man, and release to us Barabbas.'" So we're not talking about the general public here. We're talking about all the religious people in that area, because everybody else hadn't even started their day good yet. And Barabbas, who had been thrown into prison for a certain rebellion made in the city and for murder. Pilate, therefore, wishing to release Jesus, again called out to them. But they shouted, saying, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Then he said to them the third time, "Why? What evil has he done? I found no reason for death in him. I will therefore chastise him and let him go." But they were insistent, demanding with loud voices that he be crucified. And the voices of these men and the chief priests prevailed. So Pilate gave sentence that it should be as they requested. And he released to them the one they requested, who for rebellion and murder had been thrown into prison, which is Barabbas, but he delivered Jesus to their will. So Pilate was the reluctant judge to pass sentence on Jesus. Now as they were led away, they laid hold of a certain man, Simon, a Cyrene, who was coming from the country, and on him they laid the cross that he might bear it after Jesus. So Jesus was carrying the cross at this point, and he couldn't make it all the way. He had already been beaten. The Gospel of Luke doesn't go into a lot of detail about this, but he had already been scourged. He had already been beaten. He had already been slapped around. The crown of thorns had already been placed on his head. All these things had happened. He is now on the road taking his cross up to Calvary or Golgotha. And because of a lack of blood, loss of blood, and just the beating that he had been taken, he was falling down. He couldn't take it. So they grabbed this guy, Simon, out of the crowd because he was a foreigner, and they say, "You carry it for him." Verse 27, "And a great multitude of the people followed him, and women who also mourned and lamented him. But Jesus, turning to them, said, 'Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For indeed the days are coming in which they will say, Blessed are the barren wombs that never bore, and breasts which never nursed. Then they will begin to say to the mountains, Fall on us, and to the hills, Cover us. For if they do these things in the greenwood, what will be done in the dry? And there were also 2 other criminals led with him to be put to death. And when they had come to the place called Calvary, there they crucified him and the criminals, one on the right hand and the other on the left. Then Jesus said, Father, forgive them. He's not talking about the criminals. He's talking about the ones that crucified him, for they do not know what they do. And they divided. The love. Can you imagine the love and the compassion of Jesus? That even here he's hanging on the cross and he's been beat and he's just suffering a horrible death. And still he asks the Father, forgive him. You know, when we stop, if you really stop and think about that, I'm sure almost everybody watching this has been offended at somebody at some time. And unfortunately, many Christians hang on to offenses over, compared to what Jesus was going through, you would call a petty thing. It doesn't amount to much. Somebody said something, somebody may have even done something to you. I'm not saying it wasn't real and it wasn't a real offense, but Jesus was pretty clear in his teaching. Listen, forgive those who sin against you. Forgive those who treat you badly. Forgive them. And we see Jesus right here on the cross practicing what he preached. So here he's being crucified, and what does he do? Father, forgive him. And they divided his clothes, and they cast lots, and the people stood looking on. But even the rulers with them sneered, saying, he saved others. Let him save himself, if he is the Christ, the chosen of God. And the soldiers also mocked him, coming and offering sour wine, and saying, if you are the king of the Jews, save yourself. And an inscription also was written over him in letters of Greek, Latin, and Hebrew that said, this is the King of the Jews. Then one of the criminals who was hanged blasphemed him, saying, if you are the Christ, save yourself and us. But the other, answering, rebuked him, saying, do you not even fear God, seeing that you are under the same condemnation? And we indeed justly, for we receive the reward due of our deeds. But this man, he's done nothing wrong. So the prisoners, the criminals that were hanging on the cross were having a conversation back and forth. Then the one criminal that was talking about the fear of God, he said to Jesus, Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus said to him, assuredly, I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise. Now, if you remember the story earlier on in the Gospel of Luke about Lazarus and the beggar, they were in Abraham's bosom. Here, Jesus called it paradise. It was in the center of the earth. Jesus did not go to heaven that day. He entered into the bowels of the earth where there is hell, Hades, the place of torment for the unrighteous dead, but it was also the place of Abraham's bosom or paradise for the righteous dead. And it's there in that place that he preached to the righteous dead and said, I am the Messiah that you have been looking forward to. And then later on it tells us he led captivity captive. In other words, he led them out of that place, because now when he rose, they rose with him, and he was able to take them on into heaven where they are to this day. Now, when we die nowadays, we don't have to go to paradise or we don't have to go to Abraham's bosom. We go straight into the presence of God in this place called heaven, and it's glorious. And that thief, that criminal who was on the cross beside Jesus that day, went with him because he professed his love and his devotion, and that Jesus was truly the Son of God. And so let's leave it there today, and we'll pick this up tomorrow. You be blessed. Amen.